Jack Lemmon was walking down Vine Street when he saw the man sitting against the brick wall. Dirty clothes, graying beard, a cardboard sign that read "Veteran, anything helps." Jack had passed dozens of homeless people that morning. Los Angeles in 1981 was full of them. But something about this man made Jack stop. Something about the way he sat, straight back despite everything, made Jack look twice. And then he saw the eyes. Those eyes. Jack knew those eyes. He had seen them 28 years ago, staring at him across a parade ground at Fort Ord, California. Demanding more, expecting better, accepting nothing less than excellence. Captain William Reynolds. To understand what happened on that September morning in 1981, you need to understand who Jack Lemmon was before he became Jack Lemmon. Before the Oscars, before the fame, before Hollywood knew his name. In 1953, Jack was drafted into the United States Army. He was 28 years old, already working in television, already building a career. The Army didn't care. Everyone served. Jack reported to Fort Ord for basic training. He was older than most of the other recruits, more educated, more experienced in life. He thought that would make it easier. He was wrong. His commanding officer was Captain William Reynolds. 42 years old, career military, a veteran of World War II who had seen combat in the Pacific. Reynolds was the kind of officer who believed that the Army made men, and he took that responsibility seriously. He was hard, demanding, and compromising, and he saw something in Jack Lemmon that Jack didn't see in himself. Reynolds pushed Jack harder than anyone else. When the platoon ran 5 miles, Jack ran 6. When they did 50 push-ups, Jack did 75. When they had an hour of downtime, Reynolds would find Jack and make him practice drill formations until his legs shook. The other recruits thought Reynolds had it out for Jack, that he was punishing him for being older, for being educated, for having a career waiting for him outside the Army. But Jack understood something different. Reynolds wasn't punishing him, he was preparing him. One night, about 6 weeks into basic training, Reynolds called Jack to his office. Jack stood at attention, exhausted from a 14-hour day of training. Reynolds sat behind his desk, studying Jack with those intense eyes. Reynolds told Jack he had been watching him, not just his physical performance, but how he carried himself, how he interacted with the other men, how he responded to pressure, and Reynolds wanted to tell Jack something. He said that life was going to test Jack in ways he couldn't imagine. Success, fame, pressure, expectations. People would want things from him. They would try to tear him down. They would wait for him to fail. And when those moments came, Jack would need to remember what he learned here. Not the drill formations or the rifle maintenance. The real lessons about discipline, about not quitting when everything in you wants to quit, about standing straight when the world is trying to bend you. Reynolds told Jack he saw strength in him. Not physical strength, character, the kind that doesn't break. But character needs to be forged, like steel. It needs heat and pressure. That's why Reynolds pushed him harder than the others. Because Jack could take it. Because Jack needed to know he could take it. Jack never forgot that conversation. When he got to Hollywood and the rejections piled up, he thought about Reynolds. When the critics savaged his early performances, he thought about Reynolds. When the pressure to quit, to take easier roles, to compromise his standards became overwhelming, he heard Reynolds' voice. Stand straight, don't break. By 1955, Jack's service was complete. He went back to Hollywood. His career exploded. Mr. Roberts in 1955. Some Like It Hot in 1959. The Apartment in 1960. 2 Oscars. Wealth Beyond Imagination. And through it all, he carried Reynolds' lessons with him. Jack tried to find Reynolds after he became famous. Sent letters to the Army asking for his whereabouts. But Reynolds had retired in 1968 after 30 years of service. The trail went cold after that. Jack assumed Reynolds was somewhere enjoying retirement, maybe telling war stories to grandchildren, living the peaceful life he'd earned. Jack never imagined he would find William Reynolds sitting on a sidewalk in Hollywood, holding a cardboard sign. September 17, 1981, 10:23 a.m., Vine Street between Hollywood Boulevard and Sunset. Jack had just left a meeting with his agent. He was walking to his car, parked 3 blocks away. The morning was warm. Los Angeles traffic hummed around him. Street vendors sold maps to stars' homes. Tourists took pictures. And on the corner, sitting against the wall of a closed theater, was a man in his 70s. His clothes were stained and worn. His face was weathered, marked by years of sun and hardship. But he sat with his back straight, his shoulders squared, even in his condition maintaining a bearing that spoke of military discipline. Jack walked past, took 3 steps, then stopped. Something about that posture, something about the way the man held himself despite everything. Jack turned around and looked at the man's face, really looked, past the beard, past the grime, past the years. And he saw it, the same sharp eyes, the same strong jaw, the same presence that had commanded an entire company of soldiers. Jack's legs went weak. He stepped closer. The man didn't look up at first, just sat there staring at the sidewalk in front of him. Jack said the name, Captain Reynolds. The man's head snapped up, his eyes focused on Jack. For a long moment, there was no recognition, just the wary look of someone who'd been on the streets long enough to be suspicious of everyone. Then the eyes changed, widened. The man's mouth opened slightly. He said Jack's name, not as a question, as a statement of disbelief. Jack knelt down on the sidewalk. He was wearing an expensive suit. He didn't care. He knelt right there on the dirty concrete and looked at his former commanding officer. He asked what happened. What was Reynolds doing here? Reynolds looked away. Shame crossed his face. He said it was a long story. Jack told him he had time. They sat there on Vine Street for the next 2 hours. Reynolds talked. Jack listened. And the story that emerged was one that Jack would never forget. After retiring from the Army in 1968, Reynolds had struggled to adjust to civilian life. 30 years in the military, and suddenly he was just another retiree. No structure, no purpose, no mission. His wife had left him 10 years earlier, unable to handle the constant deployments. His children were grown, scattered across the country, living their own lives. Reynolds got a job as a security guard, then as a warehouse supervisor, but he couldn't adapt. The civilian world didn't make sense to him. People didn't follow orders. Nobody had discipline. Everything was chaos. He got fired from 3 jobs in 5 years for being too rigid, too demanding, too military. In 1974, his pension stopped coming. Some bureaucratic mix-up that Reynolds didn't understand and couldn't navigate. He tried to fix it, spent months writing letters, making phone calls, visiting offices. But he was just one old soldier in a system that didn't care. The money never came back. He burned through his savings by 1976. Lost his apartment in 1977, started sleeping in his car. Then the car broke down and he couldn't afford to fix it. By 1979, he was on the streets. Reynolds told Jack he tried to find work, tried shelters. But shelters had rules he couldn't accept, or they were full, or they weren't safe. The streets were easier, more predictable. He had survived worse during the war. He could survive this. But surviving wasn't living. Reynolds knew that. He just didn't know what else to do. He was 71 years old. Nobody hired 71-year-old homeless veterans. Nobody cared about his service record or his leadership experience. He was invisible. Jack sat there listening, and with every word, his heart broke a little more. This man had taught him how to stand, how to be strong, how to never give up, and the world had forgotten him, left him on a street corner with a cardboard sign. When Reynolds finished talking, there was a long silence. Jack stared at the sidewalk. Reynolds stared at nothing. Then Jack asked Reynolds if he remembered that night at Fort Ord, the conversation in the office. Reynolds nodded slowly. He remembered. Jack told him that conversation had saved his life. Not literally, but in every way that mattered. When Hollywood tried to break him, Reynolds' words kept him whole. When success made him soft, Reynolds' lessons kept him disciplined. Everything Jack had achieved, every bit of strength he'd shown in his career, came from what Reynolds taught him in those 12 weeks of basic training. Reynolds' eyes filled with tears. He said that was his job. Training soldiers, making them ready. Jack shook his head. It was more than that. Reynolds made men, real men. Men who could withstand pressure. Men who kept their promises. Men who stood straight no matter what. And Jack was living proof. He was successful because Reynolds taught him how to be. Then Jack said something that made Reynolds look up sharply. Jack told him that now it was his turn. Reynolds had given Jack the tools to build a life. Now Jack was going to give Reynolds his life back. Reynolds started to protest. He said he didn't want charity. He didn't want pity. He was fine. Jack cut him off. This wasn't charity. This was repayment. A debt Jack owed. And besides, Jack needed something from Reynolds. He needed more lessons. Because success had made Jack comfortable, maybe too comfortable. He needed Reynolds to remind him what really mattered. To teach him something new, just like the old days. Reynolds stared at Jack, trying to figure out if this was real or some kind of cruel joke. Jack stood up and extended his hand. He told Reynolds to come with him. Right now, they were going to fix this. Reynolds looked at Jack's hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached up and took it. Jack pulled him to his feet. Reynolds stood there, swaying slightly, not quite believing this was happening. Jack kept his hand on Reynolds' shoulder. He told him they were going to get him cleaned up, get him some proper clothes, get him a meal, and then they were going to sit down and have a real conversation. Because Jack had questions, and Reynolds always had answers. They walked together down Vine Street. Jack in his expensive suit, Reynolds in his tattered clothes. People stared. Jack didn't care. He had found the man who made him who he was. Everything else was irrelevant. Jack took Reynolds to his home in Beverly Hills. His wife, Felicia, opened the door and immediately saw the situation. She didn't ask questions. She just welcomed Reynolds in, showed him to the guest bathroom, and laid out fresh clothes that belonged to Jack. While Reynolds showered, Jack made phone calls. First to his doctor, arranging a full medical examination. Then to his lawyer, asking about pension issues and veteran benefits. Then to a real estate agent he knew, asking about available rentals in safe neighborhoods. Reynolds emerged 40 minutes later looking like a different man. Clean, shaved, dressed in clothes that fit, but it was more than that. He stood straighter, his eyes were clearer. Some small part of his old self was visible again. They sat in Jack's living room. Felicia brought coffee and sandwiches. Reynolds ate slowly, with discipline, the way he'd learned in the military. Never gorge yourself, food is fuel, not entertainment. Jack asked Reynolds the question he'd been thinking about for 2 hours. What lessons did Reynolds have now? What could he teach Jack today that he didn't teach him in 1953? Reynolds was quiet for a long time. Then he started talking. He told Jack that the army taught him about strength, about discipline, about standing straight under pressure. And those were good lessons. Important lessons. Jack had learned them well. But there was something the army didn't teach, something Reynolds had learned the hard way on these streets. Reynolds said he'd learned about humility. Real humility. Not the false modesty people show in public, but actual, deep humility that comes from having everything stripped away. When you're on the streets, you can't pretend anymore. Can't hide behind rank or reputation. You're just a human being, vulnerable and small. And that teaches you things that success never can. It teaches you that everyone you see has a story. The businessman walking past you had struggles you'll never know about. The kid who spits at you is dealing with pain you can't imagine. Everyone is fighting battles that are invisible to everyone else. And once you understand that, really understand it, you can't go back to judging people. You can't dismiss them. You see their humanity because you've been forced to confront your own. Reynolds told Jack that success was dangerous. It built walls around you, insulated you from other people's pain, made you think you were different, special, above the struggles of ordinary people, but you're not. You're just lucky. And luck runs out. His luck ran out. Anyone's luck can run out. And when it does, you hope someone will see you, really see you. Not what you've become, but who you are underneath. He said Jack saw him today. On that street corner, Jack could have walked past. Most people did, but Jack stopped. Jack looked. Jack saw the person underneath the circumstances. That's a gift, a rare one. And Reynolds wanted Jack to keep doing that. Not just for old soldiers, but for everyone. See people. Really see them. Because at the end of your life, Reynolds said, nobody remembers your success. They remember your kindness. They remember if you saw them when they were invisible. They remember if you helped them when they couldn't help themselves. That's the legacy that matters, not the awards or the money or the fame. The moments when you chose to see someone's humanity and act on it. Jack sat there absorbing every word. These weren't the lessons Reynolds taught at Fort Ord, but they were just as important. Maybe more important. Jack asked Reynolds to make him a promise. Reynolds asked what promise that was. Jack said he wanted Reynolds to stay with him. Not forever, not as charity, but for a while. A month, 2 months. However long it took to get Reynolds back on his feet. During that time, they would have conversations like this. Reynolds would teach Jack about humility, about seeing people, about what really matters. And in exchange, Jack would help Reynolds rebuild his life. Reynolds started to refuse. He couldn't impose like that. It was too much. Jack stopped him. He told Reynolds that 30 years ago, Reynolds didn't ask if Jack wanted extra training. He just gave it to him because it's what Jack needed. Now Jack wasn't asking either. This was what Reynolds needed. And Jack was giving it. End of discussion. Reynolds' military bearing cracked for just a moment. His eyes filled with tears again. He nodded, unable to speak. Jack smiled. He told Reynolds that settled it. They would start tomorrow. But tonight, Reynolds would have a proper meal and sleep in a proper bed. They would figure out the rest later. Over the next 3 months, Jack Lemmon and William Reynolds rebuilt the latter's life piece by piece. Jack's lawyer navigated the bureaucracy and got Reynolds' pension reinstated. 37 months of back payments arrived in a single check. Jack's doctor supervised a complete physical and dental restoration. Years of neglect were addressed, but more importantly, they talked. Every morning, Jack and Reynolds would sit on Jack's back patio and have coffee, and Reynolds would teach, not formal lessons, just observations about life, about people, about what matters. And Jack would listen, absorbing insights that you can't learn from success, only from hardship. Reynolds talked about compassion without pity, about how helping someone means respecting their dignity, not reinforcing their shame, about how sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is simply acknowledge them, see them, confirm that they exist and matter. He talked about gratitude, about how, even on the streets, there were moments of beauty, sunrises, kind words from strangers, the solidarity of other homeless people who shared what little they had. Gratitude wasn't about having everything. It was about seeing the good in whatever you had. He talked about purpose, about how losing your purpose was more devastating than losing your home. Money could be replaced, houses could be rebuilt, but purpose, the feeling that your existence matters, that was harder to restore. Reynolds had lost his purpose when he left the army. He'd spent 13 years searching for it and failing. Now, teaching Jack these lessons, he was finding it again. By December 1981, Reynolds was ready. Jack had arranged for a small apartment in Westwood. 1 bedroom, modest but comfortable. The pension covered rent and living expenses. Reynolds had new clothes, restored health, and something he'd lost years ago, hope. But Jack wasn't done. He remembered Reynolds saying that everyone needs to feel seen. That acknowledgement was a gift. So Jack did something that shocked Reynolds completely. Jack had arranged for Reynolds to work, not as charity, as an actual job. Jack had connections with several veteran organizations in Los Angeles. He introduced Reynolds as a consultant, someone who understood what homeless veterans faced because he'd lived it. Organizations paid Reynolds to train their staff, to help them understand the invisible population they served. Reynolds was skeptical at first. What did he have to offer? He'd failed at civilian life. He'd ended up on the streets. Jack corrected him. Reynolds had succeeded where most people never would. He'd survived. He'd maintained his dignity even when the world tried to strip it away. He'd learned lessons that couldn't be taught in classrooms. That knowledge was valuable. Organizations needed it. Veterans needed it. And Reynolds discovered Jack was right. When he talked to social workers and nonprofit staff, they listened. When he trained volunteers, they understood things they'd never grasped before. Reynolds had found a new purpose, teaching again, serving again, making a difference again, but Jack added one more piece. He didn't tell Reynolds about this part until it was done. Jack had contacted a local restaurant, a family-owned Italian place called Vincenzo's on Pico Boulevard. Jack knew the owner, had eaten there for years. He made an arrangement. William Reynolds would eat at Vincenzo's every day. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. The meals were prepaid for the next 10 years. The staff was instructed to treat Reynolds like family. His table would always be ready. His coffee would always be hot. He would never eat alone unless he chose to. When Jack told Reynolds about this, the old soldier broke down completely. He asked why Jack was doing so much. He didn't deserve this. Jack told him that was exactly wrong. Reynolds deserved everything good that happened to him. He'd served his country for 30 years. He'd trained thousands of soldiers. He taught Jack how to be a man. And then the country he served forgot about him. That was the injustice. Jack was just trying to balance the scales a little. Reynolds shook his head. He said Jack had given him more than he could ever repay. His life back, his purpose back, his dignity back. Jack smiled and told Reynolds he'd already repaid it. The lessons Reynolds taught him over the past 3 months were worth more than money. They changed how Jack saw the world. From now on, Jack would look at every person differently, see their struggles, acknowledge their humanity, help when he could. That was Reynolds' legacy, and it would ripple outward in ways Reynolds couldn't imagine. On January 15, 1982, Reynolds moved into his apartment. Jack helped him carry the few possessions he'd accumulated: clothes, books, some photographs Jack had helped him track down from his army days. It wasn't much, but it was his. They stood in the empty living room. Reynolds looked around at his new home, still not quite believing it was real. He turned to Jack and thanked him for everything, for stopping on the street, for seeing him, for giving him another chance at life. Jack hugged the old soldier. He told Reynolds there was no need for thanks. They'd helped each other. That's what people should do. That's what Reynolds taught him. After Jack left, Reynolds sat alone in his apartment. He thought about the past 13 years, the failures, the losses, the desperation. And then he thought about the past 3 months, the hope, the restoration, the future that suddenly existed again. He understood now what Jack meant about ripples, because Reynolds was going to take what he'd learned and use it to help other veterans, and those veterans would help others. And the cycle would continue. Jack saved one man, but that one man would touch dozens of lives, and those dozens would touch hundreds. The mathematics of compassion didn't add, they multiplied. True to his word, Jack Lemmon changed after his encounter with William Reynolds. People who worked with him noticed it immediately. He was more present, more attentive to the crew and staff on his film sets. He remembered names better, asked about people's families, noticed when someone was struggling. He started volunteering at veteran organizations, quietly, without publicity, just showing up and talking to homeless vets, listening to their stories, helping where he could. He funded programs that helped veterans transition to civilian life. He pushed Hollywood friends to do the same, and most importantly, he saw people. On the street, in restaurants, everywhere he went. He made eye contact with homeless individuals, acknowledged them, sometimes helped them, always recognized their humanity. Jack's friends noticed the change. They asked what happened. Jack would just say he'd learned some important lessons from an old teacher. He didn't elaborate. Some things were too personal to share with the media. William Reynolds lived in that apartment for the next 18 years. He worked with veteran organizations until he was 86, finally retiring in 1996. He ate at Vincenzo's every single day. The staff there knew him by name, saved his favorite table, knew his order before he asked. He became part of the family, just as Jack had arranged. Jack and Reynolds stayed close. They met for coffee once a month, maintaining the tradition they'd started on Jack's patio. Reynolds continued teaching, Jack continued learning. The lessons evolved, deepened, but the core remained the same. See people, respect people, help people. In 1999, Reynolds' health began to decline. He was 91 years old. Jack visited him in the hospital during his final days. Reynolds was weak, his voice barely a whisper, but his eyes were still sharp, still present. He told Jack one last lesson, the most important one. Reynolds said that life comes full circle if you live it right. Jack found him on the street and saved him. But really, Reynolds had found Jack again when Jack needed him most. Because success makes you forget what matters, makes you lose perspective. Reynolds reminded Jack, taught him to see people again, so really, they saved each other. That's how life works, Reynolds said. We save each other. Sometimes dramatically, sometimes quietly, but we're all connected. We all need each other. And the measure of a good life isn't what you achieve. It's how many people you help achieve their own lives. Reynolds told Jack he was proud of him, not for the Oscars or the fame, for the man he'd become, for how he used his success to help others, for how he saw people. That was the real achievement. William Reynolds died on June 3, 1999. Jack spoke at his funeral. He told the story of finding Reynolds on Vine Street, of the lessons learned, of the life rebuilt, and he told the dozens of veterans in attendance that Reynolds never stopped serving. He just changed the battlefield. After the funeral, 3 homeless veterans approached Jack. They told him Reynolds had helped them get off the streets, found them resources, guided them through the system, gave them hope. They wanted Jack to know that Reynolds' impact went far beyond what Jack saw. Reynolds had saved dozens of lives, quietly, without recognition, just doing what he believed was right. Jack wasn't surprised. That was who Reynolds was, a soldier, a teacher, a man who served because service gave life meaning. The story of Jack Lemmon and William Reynolds never became public during their lifetimes. Jack kept it private, feeling it was too personal to share. But after Jack died in 2001, his family found the journals he'd kept, page after page of conversations with Reynolds, lessons learned, reflections on how one encounter on a street corner changed everything. Jack's son released some of those journal entries with permission from Reynolds' family. The story spread, and it became a reminder that everyone you pass on the street has a story. Everyone has value, and sometimes, the person who looks like they need help the most is actually the one who has the most to teach you. William Reynolds taught Jack Lemmon how to stand straight at Fort Ord in 1953. On a street corner in Hollywood in 1981, he taught him how to see clearly. Both lessons were equally important. Both shaped the man Jack became. And in return, Jack gave Reynolds something equally valuable. He saw him. On a day when Reynolds was invisible to everyone else, Jack stopped and looked and recognized the man beneath the circumstances. That moment of recognition restored Reynolds' humanity, gave him his life back, reminded him that he still mattered. That's what shocked everyone when the story finally came out. Not that Jack Lemmon helped a homeless veteran. Hollywood celebrities do charity all the time. What shocked people was the depth of their relationship, the mutual respect, the way they helped each other, the understanding that saving someone isn't a one-way transaction. It's a collaboration, a recognition of shared humanity. Jack Lemmon found his old commanding officer on the streets and gave him a home and meals and purpose. William Reynolds found his old student lost in success and gave him perspective and humility and wisdom. They were both lost. They found each other. And they both ended up exactly where they needed to be. That's the real story. Not about a celebrity doing good, about two men recognizing each other across decades and circumstances and choosing to honor what they once meant to each other. Choosing to mean something to each other again. The apartment in Westwood still exists. After Reynolds died, Jack's family kept paying the rent for a year, then donated the lease to a veteran organization. They use it as temporary housing for homeless vets transitioning back to stability. A different veteran lives there every few months. Reynolds would have approved. Vincenzo's restaurant closed in 2004, but the family kept Reynolds' table in storage. In 2015, they opened a new location and installed that table in a place of honor. A plaque next to it tells Reynolds' story, reminds patrons that everyone deserves dignity. Everyone deserves to be seen. Jack Lemmon's legacy is usually defined by his films, The Apartment, Some Like It Hot, Glengarry Glen Ross, brilliant performances that will live forever. But for those who knew the full story, his real legacy was simpler. He stopped on a street corner. He looked at a man everyone else ignored. He saw past the circumstances to the person underneath, and he chose to act. William Reynolds' legacy is even quieter. A career soldier who trained thousands, who fell through the cracks, who rebuilt his life, who spent his final years helping others rebuild theirs. No monuments, no medals for that final service. Just lives changed. People helped, dignity restored. Two men, two legacies, both built on the same principle. See people, respect people, help people. It started with recognition on a street corner. It ended with two lives forever changed. And in between, lessons were taught that continue rippling outward today. Because somewhere right now, someone is walking past a person in need. And maybe, just maybe, they'll remember this story. They'll stop, they'll look, they'll see, and they'll choose to act. That's what Jack Lemmon did. That's what shocked everyone. Not the help itself, but the recognition that everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone has value. Everyone has something to teach us if we're humble enough to learn. Jack Lemmon recognized a homeless veteran on a street corner in Hollywood. What he did next wasn't just shock everyone. It reminded everyone what it means to be human. If this story moved you, subscribe for more incredible true stories about the humanity behind Hollywood's biggest legends. Because the greatest acts of kindness often happen away from the cameras, in quiet moments between two people who choose to see each other's worth.